So, good morning and welcome to Berlin and welcome to the panel on successful corporate communications. We want to discuss this morning because of the rapidly changing media and investment world. And we want to do it in two parts. In the first part, we want to talk about the evolvement of the media landscape in the past decade. And in the second part, we want to talk about best practice. And I propose that that the panel will take questions after each part. And first of all, I'd like to introduce the panelists we have invited this morning. I'll start with Eva. Eva von Schaper has a background as a chemist and biochemist. She did her master's thesis, I believe, in the lab of Nobelist Robert Huber from Max Planck Institute for Biochemistry. You may well know Robert Huber as a co-founder of, among others, I think, Suprimol and Proteros. And she then went into journalism. And Eva has written for a number of German and international newspapers. She was a healthcare reporter with Bloomberg and is now once again back to freelance work for, among others, Handelsblatt and Nature Biotechnology. Next to Eva is Cormac Sheridan. He's a trained microbiologist and started his freelance career in 1993, I believe. And so, first of all, I think you reported on IT and then switched to biotechnology. And Cormac became BioWorld correspondent in 1996, and that was when we first met because we were colleagues at that time. I was also a correspondent for BioWorld back that time. Cormac is also writing for Nature Biotechnology. On the other side of Eva is Sascha Karberg. He's a biologist, trained at the University of Berlin and MIT. He started his career as a freelancer, I think, in 2001, right? And he was working, among others, for the Life Science magazine Transcript as chief editor, and he's now the science desk editor of the German newspaper Tagesspiegel. And on the left side, from your perspective, is Mike Watt. I believe everyone will be quite familiar with him. He started his career in 1984 as an assistant editor for Chemistry and Industry, reporting on chemistry. Then started Biotech reporting in 1990. We met when he was at BioCentury. He was a senior editor with BioCentury. We were colleagues at BioCentury for a couple of years. And he's now Chief Content Officer of Data Monitor Healthcare and Scrip Intelligence. And right next to me is Stephen Hanson. He started with BA in biology and was news editor of BioCentury in 2006, and then in the meantime became associate editor of BioCentury, and he's based in the UK. So most of you look back at a long career in biotech reporting, and I'd like to ask you, how has journalism changed since you began reporting? What impact has that had on your reporting, and what are your observations on the sector? I'd like to start with Eva.
Well, I think, how has it changed? I think everybody knows that it's just gotten faster. I was just thinking, what did we do when we didn't have Twitter, when we didn't have this incessant stream of news that you can see on your PC, and you're seeing the news scrolling down, and you're always thinking, so what's coming up? What are other people writing about? And this feeling of the always faster and non-stop quality of news That's something that I think has happened over maybe the past 5 years.
Okay, Cormac?
There's one aspect of journalism that I think has not changed at all, and that's the fact that journalism, as opposed to other forms of publishing information, involves talking to people. It involves interviewing people and reporting what they say to hopefully interested readers. I think Ava's point is very well made, and I would also add, in addition to the time factor, there's been a sort of a geographical shift. The industry now is much, much more global than it was 20 years ago. Back 20 years ago, it was this very sort of regionalized kind of industry, and every kind of region was trying to kind of get a bit of global visibility. Now it is much more integrated globally, and obviously you say European companies are getting finance in NASDAQ now commonly, and it has become a much more global industry and more globally aware, and it's just matured and become more sophisticated as well as an industry. So I think it's gone through a process of maturation the last 20 years, and that obviously sort of one's journalism has to sort of implicitly reflect that too.
Mike, would you agree?
So when I started journalism, we didn't use electric typewriters. We used to actually, it was manual, and we typed our copy and had carbon copies that we retained. So I mean, so in the sort of 33 years that I've been covering it, what we've actually sort of seen is a switch from information, which 33 years ago, went slow, was stuff came in the post. There wasn't even a fax machine. So I remember when I think the really fast stuff was telex, which, if anybody ever remembers what that is. But so what you would do is information was what was key. It was really just people just want to know what was happening. And what we've actually sort of seen is with the sort of the advent and the speed of things like sort of the internet, etc., and the fact that companies can take more control of their own news narrative, that there's now a bigger requirement for intelligence. So where it's this has happened, and journalists now are expected to wrap data around that. So it's not just about speaking to people and getting the story. It's actually sort of thinking, so what, and then finding the answers to that.
Sasha, do you think it has changed in the way that you have to write more content, and what has changed in terms of reader expectations for content?
Yeah, I might have to go back a little bit to my freelance time. So I started as a freelancer, and in this respect, nothing changed so much really from my perspective, because as a freelancer, you always try to write the bigger stories, the background stories, because already 10 or 15 years ago, you couldn't really live on writing just for newspapers, because they just it was just not an effective way to get along. So I always looked for the bigger stories, and in this respect, I also didn't really have a big problem that information was coming too fast for me or so, because usually I was the one who was confronting editors with new science things. For example, RNA interference, when that came up, when I heard about that, the editors didn't understand why is this important or so, and I really had a hard time to explain why it could be important. So I think we, as science journalists at least, we still have a kind of an advantage, because we know many things much, much earlier than editorial boards are able to even think about that this might become important. So, I think from now for the Tagesspiegel, for example, we really, I'm looking for stories who give me the background, because the daily work is done online, and anyone reads Twitter anyway, so these tiny pieces of information get across anyway. And as a journalist, I think my purpose is to give more background information and really tell them what the information really means. Okay, so what will change due to this new technology or whatever. So that's what I always looked for as a freelancer, and now as an editor, I'm looking for such stories too. So that's probably, and I think the reader is really looking for this content because, the snippets of information get through to him through Twitter anyway.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of background, Stephen, whom do you talk to for background? How important is it to have a network, and what kind of persons are most important for your network to provide some background? Is it investors? Is it scientists? Who is it?
All of the above, I guess. We like to, I would say a lot of times, I guess it depends on the setting. If we're interested in something where it's a bit more of a scientific approach, then we'll be talking to, the C-level suite, we'll be talking to the scientists that are working on it. A lot of times, maybe talking to doctors, wanting to get their take on, what a new therapy or a new sort of modality means. But a lot of times also we're very interested in the investors, because obviously nowadays investing has become such a specialized area that they themselves are just as tuned up and know as much about the science as as the academics do as well. So they're also a lot of times very important, because they can tell you exactly why they're investing in a company and what that why that was such an important investment to make.
And how has investor sentiment changed over the last years? What is different from what they expected, say, 10 years ago and today?
Public or private? I guess is both. Well, I guess they're sort of the consummate optimists, I would say. Even in the down times of 2010, 2011. How it's changed, I guess, is that there's much more, we've already sort of talked about this before, but just sort of the global aspect. We see it even now on the venture side. There's more interest, I would say, from VCs to sort of look beyond their typical borders. They used to be very much a regional. That's a VC wants to be able to sit down with their company, on a very frequent basis, and so they typically just play it in their own backyard. Whereas I think nowadays we're seeing much more of an interest in potentially broadening that out and sort of they build their own networks, and so they have trusted other potential syndicate partners that they would be willing to invest with, sort of in Europe. So we're seeing more US VCs looking across, and so I think it's just sort of that global nature, especially on the private side. That's always been the way on the public side, but that's one way it's changed.
Mike, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so I think there are two things. One is that investors have become much more sophisticated. And they understand the amount of money that's actually required to get these companies to work. Obviously, they have the advantage that many of them have actually managed to get returns on their own investment. So we've actually sort of seen quite a lot of success. The industry is no longer sort of just US focused. It doesn't speak with an American accent as much as it used to. But I think that, for example, when I was talking about the amounts of money, in the past, sort of somebody would go and do an initial public offering in Europe, and if they raised £30 million or $40 million, that would be a big deal. Whereas now it's not uncommon to see a Series A financing by private investors of that size. So I think that you just have to look at the amounts of money that are being raised and the sort of total amounts of money. So again, when I first started, I remember sort of in the mid-90s, Europe would have raised $1 billion, and that was seen as a big number. Whereas now, the UK alone would raise that. So, so for Europe, probably about $4 billion it would raise in a year. So there's a lot more money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A comic. What has changed in terms of topics? Do you write more science stories nowadays, or more financing stories, or more corporate development stories?
I don't know if I really have changed. It might be the nature of what you're actually writing, but I still would write the same mix of stories about investment, also about science, and also about mainly companies. The nature of it, though, has changed dramatically. BioEurope, obviously, I've been coming to BioEurope for quite a few years, and it was always the time to do a bit of breast beating and wailing in the cold wind of the European investment climate, and make these unflattering comparisons and contrasts with the US, and basically, and the Germans, of course, are great for sort of being gloomy about things like the lack of money, and they still are as well. But that kind, as Mike was saying, the industry no longer speaks with an American accent, and I think just in the last few years, really, that story has now disappeared. The money is there, and it's up to the companies to get it. If they're good enough and they have a compelling enough offering to the market, the money is there and they just need to get it. And we've seen it example after example of European companies raising good money from not only VC as well, because especially in the UK, you have this patient capital phenomenon, funds that have way more money than your typical classical venture capital fund, who also invest with much different time horizons, and they have a much more integrated understanding of the nature of drug development, and they're much more long-term investors. So they're around too, and they're competing with VC, so that means that, and the deal sizes are getting bigger. So VC as well has had to kind of change. It can no longer kind of get in and get out maybe as quickly. It varies, obviously, sometimes that happens too. But what I'm saying is that I guess there's more variety going on in terms of financing transactions, and that's actually more interesting to report on too. But so that at least as well, there's something to write about at last, not just that there's no more money.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we have now talked about the situation mainly in the trade media, and what about the more general media? I believe you're mostly writing science stories, so what has changed? Is there an increased appetite of the media for science stories, of the readers? Does it match? And what is your observation on science as a topic in more general media?
Well, I think first, if I just take a step back and talk about pharma, I think what's changed is that pharma stories themselves have become more mainstream, especially everything about cost, obviously. If you look at the US media, drug costs, are they too high? Patenting questions, we see them in the mainstream media, and this is not something that would have happened just a couple of years ago, and I think that's very important to note. I think that's one side, talking about costs, and the other side is probably also people are not only readers, but they're also consumers, so they also want to know, what do my elderly parents have, what drugs are they taking, and they want to keep up with that side of the development as well. And also, can I get into this clinical trial? So they're also really interested in developments that are a bit earlier along. I think that's something that we've been seeing.
And do you feel that the appetite of the publishers of general media for science stories has become bigger or smaller?
I think talking about the English-speaking media, I think we're seeing more niche and specialty publications. Mm-hmm. Just looking at straight science, I mean, if you look at Quanta, for example, that's something that's actually quite wonderful, or Aeon, there's an online magazine about science, which is very sophisticated take on science, very interesting. And I think the Boston Globe has a wonderful website called STAT, which is all about science, drug development, pharma, and those are all things I think we didn't have 5 years ago.
Sasha, what do you think? I mean, you've experience in both worlds, trade media as well as general news media. What has changed in science journalism?
Yeah, I think kind of we had a couple of years ago we had kind of a boom in science reporting, but that's definitely over, I have to say, because many editorial boards just cut back on jobs on science editors, and that's also true for the Tagesspiegel. We've been about 4 or 5 people at times there who were dealing with the natural sciences and medicine, and now I'm probably the last one at the end of the month, probably. So we will see how this will develop, but this is just telling you about the trend. So, and this is, I think the problem is you are right that there is more reporting about pharma, but that's only happening really in the economics parts of the newspapers, and the problem here is that you need some specialists for that, because otherwise then you only have the reporting about, okay, this is a drug which is that costs $1 million for this patient or so, and then so this is kind of the more sensational side of reporting about it, and it's only picked up if it's kind of such a bad news thing, okay? So it's too expensive, and you don't get the background why it might be so expensive, and because you just don't have the room about that. So if you don't have the specialists who know about the biotech industry and how pharmaceuticals are developed, you run into problems, and you don't have these specialists anymore within the editorial board, or at least much less than years before at the Financial Times, for example, German issue, I mean. And so, for example, now the problem often is that there is a story that might be science-related, but also more economic-related, and it kind of falls between the two editorial boards. So I can't do it because I just don't have the time, and it's not science enough. It's in my perspective, and then the economics colleagues say, no, that's science, and I don't understand what's behind that company. So we don't report about it then. So, and this is, I think, true for many other newspapers too. So, and so in my perspective, science, it was cut back on science within the last years, unfortunately.
Stephen. The industry certainly has become much more mature in the last 10, 15 years. So there is more to report on mature companies, on phase 3 trials, on marketed drugs, on things like that. So has it become more difficult for startups who are new to the market to get their story across?
Potentially, I mean, it's definitely a much more crowded field now than there is. I mean, obviously, we see with the boom from what the sector's done since 2012. I mean, there was obviously, we added a couple hundred companies to the public markets, and the VCs, obviously on the back of all those winnings, as Mike was talking about, have been very successful at raising additional funds, and they've been sort of flooding with startups. So there's definitely a it's I don't know what you guys would say, but I definitely get pitched about new startups, new companies coming out of stealth, these sorts of things probably, if not daily, it's probably a couple times a week. So it's definitely hard, and in the same way, like I'm sure you've seen this as well in cancer, from the moment that Yervoy was approved, cancer companies started shifting, from being sort of oncology companies to being immuno-oncology companies, even if they were previously there wasn't really an immunology link. They obviously were really looking fine ones. So it's trying to differentiate, I think, can be. I guess that's one of the things that we would look for is what is. What is that unique sort of selling proposition that sort of sets you apart? It's very similar to what we, when I speak to a new startup, it's, I say, well, what's the pitch that you gave to your investors? That's what I first like to hear is, why are they investing in you? What makes their money worth it? So.
Yeah, I'd just like to come in on that one, because to me, a startup, everybody loves babies and everybody loves startups. And a startup that has a kind of an interesting proposition scientifically, you get a kind of a free pass. You will always, in BioWorld at least, get the profile story, that we'll give a deep dive on the science and talk about your dreams and aspirations and report on them as if they're going to become hard reality in 5 years' time. And after that, we don't really want to know you unless you've actually done something really significant. But a startup always gets a shot. And so I think there's always room for startup stories, and especially ones that obviously are significant in terms of funding. The old days of being interested in a startup that's raised 2 million, forget it. 10 million is kind of table stakes, and it's nicer to have 20 or 30, a bit of drama. But I think a startup will always get a fair hearing if they're in any way interesting.
Yeah, so to echo what Stephen was saying about the number of pitches, we get them a lot. Sort of, it is almost on a daily basis. If I had my iPhone here, you just hear the emails pinging in, just going ping, 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 and it's pretty irritating because it starts at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Is that Tinder now or pitches?
Yeah.
So we'll get to that in the second part.
But if we look at for example, the kind of companies, because of the volume, what it means is actually we then have to almost like look differently. So in the past, with a startup company, you would spill quite a lot of ink on it. You would write, a 1,200, 1,500 word profile, whereas these days you literally cut to the chase. It's like, what's the problem that you think you've got, that you think you need to solve? What's your solution? What do you actually have to do to move that on? And it's literally those sort of 3 paragraphs. So what we're finding is we're having to, not give as much airtime to each individuals. And the other thing is also because, again, the sheer volume, Stephen was saying about, the immuno-oncology space, what we now will do is we'll tend to lump a whole bunch of companies together, because again, none of these companies are created in vacuo, and it's all very well sort of saying, we've got the solution, because we had 3 people last week saying that they had the solution to the same issue. So what we have to do is we have to kind of put it into a context and almost do a sort of compare and contrast.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Eva, did you want to add on that?
Well, I could just talk about my time at Bloomberg, and that obviously for Bloomberg it was always only listed companies, and privately held was not interesting. And if IPO, you'd have to get over a certain threshold. Mm-hmm. So that was always a topic.
Yeah. So everyone is talking now on social media, and do you think social media has affected your reporting? And would you recommend a company to create a social media account? And if so, which one would you recommend? Mike?
Yes, so social media, in fact, I think it's this week, The Economist has got on its front cover, social media is just like the end of democracy. Social media is one of those things that actually empowers companies, because it allows them to get their message out the way that they want it. But it also means you have to remember that it's their version of the truth. We use social media partly to let people know what we're writing about, but also sometimes. So, for example, if we get a press release, okay, and it says that effectively there's going to be no more information apart from what's in the press release, frankly, we're not going to waste any time on it. What we'll do is we'll just retweet or send out into social media that press release. That's all the company's saying. There isn't really much more to say about this. Particularly if it's just something we actually knew was going to happen. This is just a sort of statement that it's happened. Social media, it's useful for us also as journalists, as a radar, because all of a sudden, if we see an awful lot of Twitter activity around something, it's something sort of thing, right, okay, maybe this is a red flag that we should start looking at.
Cormac, what's your take on this question?
My take on this question is a really amateur take, if I can say that, because I am not a communications strategist, even though I do consume the outputs of communication strategies. I think social media is a really interesting addition to the sort of conversation. It's a way of having the conversation in a different way, a different space. In terms of the different platforms, I mean, the only two that I take seriously are Twitter and LinkedIn. But I feel LinkedIn, especially for me, has kind of degraded in the last couple of years. It's just become very sort of an awful lot of kind of corporate bullshit, really, and kind of PR stuff. I find Twitter more refreshing and immediate, and I like it a lot. But I mean, companies themselves who have, you know, whole departments devoted to this have a much, much richer understanding of that space than I do. I don't know anything about Instagram at all. I know it exists, and that's about it.
Too old.
I'm too old, yes, thank you. And but in general, I would think that there is a sort of a communications landscape out there that is obviously much, much more complex than what we had even 10 years ago. And companies need to figure out where they want to be on that landscape and what they want to achieve in their position. But they would be absolutely crazy to ignore it. It's fine to take a look and decide, well, that's not for us actually at this point. That's okay too. But you just need to make sure you're looking at it, because you obviously need to have visibility to various audiences, whether it's investors, potential partners, maybe customers as well. Although I know obviously in Europe there's a completely different ballgame around how direct-to-consumer advertising and all of that. But it's very important, there's no doubt about it.
Does anyone of you do story mining on Twitter? Do you use it for getting story ideas?
Well, I always think by the time it's on Twitter, it's not a story for me anymore, because I'm not the only person reading Twitter. So by that time, it's just too old. And I think this whole conversation is also part, I think, that Cormac mentioned earlier, is the question of news as a commodity. And as soon as it's a commodity, it's something that, you know, everybody produces, and the price goes down. What we want to tell as a story is something that not everybody has, and something that maybe we're in a unique position to tell. I think that's what's important.
Mm-hmm. Mike, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so we do use Twitter for mining, because, you know, in 140 characters, what people can tell you is something's happened, or they can give a reaction to something, but they don't actually explain, you know, why it happened, what the implications are, you know, what people need to be thinking about as they sort of, you know, maybe mitigate risk. So for sort of, you know, in the business press, which is totally focused on the industry, you know, we will look at, you know, what is it that people are saying. It's also really good for actually identifying, though, key opinion leaders. So if all of a sudden, you know, sort of a story's breaking, and you then sort of see some characters who are saying some pretty insightful things in 140 characters, they are potentially a new person that we can contact as a key opinion leader. So that's one of the ways that we would mine the sort of the Twitter scape.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. On that score, I recently, that's a very good point, because I recently made a new contact on Twitter. German guy, Dirk, I can't remember his second name. He's an RNAi guy. You must know him. And again, I knew he just knows everything about RNAi, and I contacted him on Twitter. I was doing a piece for Nature Biotech and interviewed him, and it was great. And he was very cooperative and really enjoyed it. So, you know, that was great. Actually, it really worked. I think what Eva and Mike are saying is kind of very interesting, because I sort of feel I'm sort of halfway between what they're saying, because I think, Eva's right, like news is a commodity, and very often I feel I'm not reporting news because everybody else has it at the same time, but I'm providing some context and I'm populating a database with what I do, and it's the archive that you're actually selling. You're not actually really selling the news because it's available in a press release anyway, and they have as rich a way of distributing as you do. But if I provide some sort of context to that news, which is obviously coming from a more objective source than a press release is, that hopefully is of some value to the subscribers of BioWorld, and that's what keeps us going. So I think it's kind of, yeah, news in context is kind of what our offer is these days.
What I could add here is probably the view of the perspective of a freelancer, because for freelancers, I think Twitter and blogs or so are really a good way to build awareness for their topic of reporting, and what are they able to report about, are they knowledgeable, and so on. So it might be a source for editors, but also for companies who would like to get out with some information to some freelancers who really know about the topic, because otherwise your press releases go out all the time in between 10,000 others and so on. So if you identify a freelancer via Twitter or via his blog or so, you can really tell, but much better, whether he might be the one you would like to contact or talk with him, and tell him probably a little bit more information so that he can get out with an interesting story or so. I think this is a good tool to, in this respect, I think story mining or even person mining, so to say, might be a good way. And I actually use Twitter for story mining, not so much about the topic, but also to see, okay, is this a story, is this discussed, is this a debatable topic or so, and that's also what we are looking for as a media for the broader public.
Okay, so I think looking on my watch, we should conclude the first part, and I would like to open the floor for questions by the audience. Just a second, so that we can record it. So you get a microphone.
So regarding the changes in the world of media, I'm not that long in business as a couple of you, but I think what I feel is that due to the fast and globalization and internet, the sources are getting much, much more. I think this is, in my opinion, a huge difference 10, 20 years ago, that you now have thousands of internet sites, newspapers, e-papers, Twitter, everything like that. So the flow of information to the normal, even industry, customer, broader public, however, is getting bigger, 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 and it's much more difficult to find the correct sources and to identify the sort of information you're looking for and to judge it. I think this is, in my opinion, a really big change, and maybe I don't know how this influences the different newspapers and the different journalists and scientific writers to find a way through this jungle.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say that I definitely have a sort of a hierarchy of sources. I mean, you know, Twitter is, as you were saying, I mean, it's very useful for sort of, especially, I mean, in my case, some of my time I spend sort of focused on the public market, so I have my own sort of customized list of companies, and if there's ever a time where, you know, I see a company moving and it's not immediately clear to me on what's sort of driving that stock move, then Twitter will be one of the first places I go to see if someone else has some ideas as to what's moving it. But it's by no means a primary source. You know, I would never cite Twitter, would never, you know, that's not, I mean, it's really, at least I still rely on interviews and on peer-reviewed publications, and these, I mean, that's, you know, PubMed and the phone are still my primary sources. And I mean, we will look at other sources to get, you know, perspective on, well, you know, do we need to to have a different view on something, but I don't think, where we source things from has changed. You might be right in that the number of sources that we can potentially reach out to has changed, but at least in terms of the priorities that I have for the sources, that's, I would say, still quite the same.
I think the question is always, is there some small blog that has some information that might become important? I think that's always the question. And in your daily work, can you find that? So at Bloomberg, where this was more important for me, I would have a web crawler that would crawl the web and crawl websites to see, has something changed on that website? And then I would get an alert, and then I could check it out. So a lot of that, there were a lot more sources, but on the other hand, I feel that you can use technology to help you kind of weed through all of this information.
Yeah, I think from the perspective of a small company, I would say this is the fast track, which is Twitter, so which gets information out. And then there's the kind of normal, I would say not slow track, but normal track, which is the peer-reviewed scientific thing. And I think good innovation is always based on good scientific publications, because it's acknowledged by the community by peer reviews. So that's sometimes Twitter goes out before some scientific information has really been approved by other people. So this creates a sort of distortion, I think.
Yes, I can definitely say that we still rely very much on nature science publications and stuff like that. So that's a problem in itself. But usually we would like to see peer-reviewed articles before we report about a certain scientific topic. But there are situations actually where there is a conference, cancer conferences or stuff like that, and the media hype, so to say, is so big that we also have to report about it. Okay, even if there is no peer-reviewed publication even on the horizon. Okay, so it's then we are sometimes in a problem, but we then can also explain why this might be disputable, the whole hype and so on. So there's also an opportunity, in my view, to explain the scientific progress. Okay, so the how it works really, yeah, but. Yes, most of this stuff we rely on these old sources.
I just want to clarify, it's not that we would wait for a peer review, in many cases. I mean, obviously, if you announce on Twitter that you have phase 1-2 data that shows a 70% response rate, I mean, that's obviously something we're going to report on. But we have sources that we, have relationships with that we would call and say, have you seen this data? Is this actually, legit, or is there something here? And so you never take it at face value. There's always you look into it, you look at your context, you use the peer review for understanding, the pathophysiology or the pathway that's working in, and to understand kind of where it slots in. And so that's where the sourcing, I think, comes in sort of elsewhere, and that hasn't really changed. Is that you still use those to sort of verify that you're not being fed a line, basically. In many cases. So.
Yeah, I think we have to be very realistic here. The idea that what we're reporting on has to be appeared in a peer review paper, that was never the case, regardless of Twitter or social media, because very often a peer review paper will lag the disclosures by several years, and we are in the news business. A corporate press release isn't necessarily some sort of poisoned object. Publicly quoted companies make disclosures under very strict disclosure rules, and generally speaking, they behave quite well. And fine, they will try to spin the data to their own advantage, et cetera, et cetera. It's our jobs to interrogate that. It's our jobs to look at the clinical trial protocol and to try to pick it apart. And if it's a hard and fast, well-conducted clinical trial that's delivered an amazing result, well, let's report it. There's nothing wrong with that. And obviously, if it's dodgy and it's an open-label trial and there were trends towards efficacy, you also report that. I mean, it's part of our job to understand this process and to interrogate it. And peer-reviewed papers are lovely, and it's lovely if there's if the first disclosure is in a peer-reviewed paper, and it's lovely if you've had that paper for a week before it's actually published as well, under embargo, but that's not necessarily the way it always works, and it's part of the process, but it's not by any means, doesn't really capture the process at all, really, to my estimation.
Just one comment. I'm not taking the position that the only thing you need to do is peer-reviewed papers. So I just want, I like the discussion, my simple question, that it comes to the point that there's a company life, and there's a company life of information, and then there's a science life of information. That's a different thing. Okay.
So it's interesting because this almost looks like a faultless segue into the sort of second part of the conversation, which is about best practice. So to come to the sort of terms of, like, you know, sort of sources, yeah, there are lots and lots of sources, and you know, our job these days actually is to filter through all the noise, to actually identify what is important, what is, and then come up with, you know, potential solutions that are actionable. So, so we have the advantage, and one of the ways is that, you know, when it comes to sort of peer review, you know, I've got 64 journalists across the globe who work for us full time. So therefore, they've got their ears to the ground on what's going on in those spaces. We also have in our company, we've got, you know, about 400 analysts. So these are people who are experts in markets or therapeutic areas, etc. So what we can do is, I can go to, you know, our oncology specialists and sort of say, look, these guys have just put out this piece of data. Is this consequential, or is this just blah? Is this just puffery? So we've got that first cut that we're able to do. But then what we also do is we then do, you know, as Stephen says, is that then there are trusted individuals that we can also you know, share information with, and sort of say, again, what does, you know, is this something that's really consequential? Are we missing something, or are we being sold a pup?
So there's one more. Right here. I'm just curious about article length. If one looks at a web page, for example, you see on the very top 3-minute read, 5-minute read, and so on and so forth. Is being terse a good thing or a bad thing? Is that something that you look at from a journalist perspective? Writing a short article, which is a 5-minute read, taking into account that attention spans are getting shorter and shorter.
All right, I'll shoot for this because, you know, I can write thousands of words. So in the old days, when journalists, we used to have to fill magazines. So we actually had to, and it was pretty difficult to find pictures, so therefore we used a lot of words. The advantage with you know, the web is that we don't have that tyranny anymore. So, you know, what I sort of say to my journalists is, you know, if you can say it in 3 or 4 paragraphs, and all the information that people need to actually do something with that can be done in 3 or 4 paragraphs, then that's great. I mean, you know, in the sort of the national newspapers, the difference between a lead story and a small story is just that in the lead story, they've just put a hell of a lot more background. After the first 3 or 4 paragraphs, actually, you should actually have the story. So I actually think that what we're finding is that, you know, people are consuming things differently. So for example, we talked about early startups earlier on. You know, one of the ways that we now cover early startups is that, you know, in fact, with those guys there, we will interview startup companies, and we'll do a 10-minute interview on video where they get the opportunity to, you know, explain what they do. We don't need to write 1,500 words. And actually, people can actually sort of see what they do. So people are consuming things differently, and the web allows us to do that.
Can I add something? I think in general there is a trend to do shorter stories. And there is a trend that as soon as something's on the internet, 500 words is often the limit, and that's longish.
Okay, thank you. I would like to move on to the second part. I mentioned that I worked as a science journalist for a couple of trade publications, but also for general media, and having founded Acampion as a PR and IR agency 11 years ago with Ines Boot. Part of my daily routine is managing expectations by biotech companies, because sure, they have interesting things to say, but there is a huge competition, and I would like to talk about this competition in terms of news and news flow and email and importance. So I'd like to ask you on the panel, can you tell us a little bit on your daily work? How many emails do you receive? Mike, you mentioned that it starts at 6 o'clock in the morning when you get up, this coming inflow of press releases and email and pitches. So how does it look like? Yeah.
Okay, it's continuous. I mean, it does happen overnight as well. It's just that, fortunately, there's not as much activity in my space in Asia as there is in Europe and on the West Coast. But it starts at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the press releases just keep coming and coming and coming till about midnight, and then there's a sort of a 6-hour hiatus. How do we do that? So what we do is we have guys who, I've got a team in Asia who will triage all the Asia content, and they will then decide, what's fit to write about and what isn't, and then they'll hand over to my European team, and they will go through the same process, and then they'll hand over to my East Coast team, and then my West Coast team, and then they back hand over to the Asia team. But it's continuous. So the way that, in fact, it's probably best not to send an email press release. I know that's not what you want to hear, but there are other ways of getting to us, which we'll talk about.
Okay, Stephen, what do you think? How many press releases do you get? How do you sift through it, and how do you select?
Probably very similar. Well, I've made the conscious decision not to have work email come through my phone for the very purpose of not wanting to be woke up at 6 in the morning. But I also work from home, so it's a 15-foot commute, so it's not as I can get to my laptop very quickly. In terms of the volume, it's probably 200, 250 releases a day, and so that's, obviously the whole day. So usually about 30 to 45 minutes every morning I spend just literally going through, and then very, very similar to what Mike said, we have a team that triages everything, and so they basically compile it, and then every day we have a discussion about everything that's come out that day, and we triage it down, because as we may talk about later, it's a global industry, and so we are basically looking to allocate our resources as effectively as we can based on what's happening. So it's how we select it is very much, we try not to have sort of thresholds on things, but clearly, as we've discussed before, if you're announcing we view Series A rounds or seed rounds a little bit differently because they're startups, and there might be something new there. But if you're raising $5 million in a Series B, chances are you're going to not make the cut and triage, and so that's really, we just have, obviously if anything is market moving for public companies, then that's obviously something we'll look at. But then on the private side, it's a proof of concept. It's anything that we think would be of consequence, but it's very much case by case, unfortunately. Yeah.
There's a friend of mine in Dublin. I was comparing notes with her. She's a venture capitalist, and she basically said to me that she sort of, for a living, she presses delete. That's what she seems to be doing, and I think she got more stuff by email than I do. I think she was getting about 500 a day or something really, really crazy. It was really mad. But we do spend a lot of time pressing delete. It's a real pain in the ass, and it's because say I'm not in charge of a global team, I'm sort of part of a team, I have a worm's eye view of it rather than the sort of global view that Mike might have, and you're just kind of getting stuff being pushed at you all the time. And I set up my own alerts as well. I have Google alerts set up around all sorts of topics and themes, and even some individual companies that interest me, and also Google Scholar alerts around scientists that interest me. So there's 20 alerts there pushing stuff at you all the day as well. And you're just living in this noisy world that's actually not good for the brain, and I don't see any easy way out from dealing with it apart from the fact that trying to do exercise to de-stress. But I mean, we just live in this noisy information universe, and there aren't really highly intelligent ways of filtering it other than just doing it and looking at the stuff and looking at headlines. And obviously what's wonderful as well, of course, is the RSS feed thing. That's a really, really quick way of looking at an awful lot of news very, very fast. I really value that. And if you are a company setting up your website, it's a very good idea just to include that little tool in your website. It's an excellent way, I think, of getting visibility quickly and effectively. So I do value that, but it's just noise, and you're just trying to surf it. As we were saying earlier when we were discussing this previously, the signal to noise ratio has really shifted in this industry. There's just so much more noise now, and you do have to work a bit harder to get the signal, but you can still pick them up.
Eva, how do you manage it as a freelancer?
Well, as a freelancer, obviously, it's easier for me to decide what I want to see and what I don't want to see. And there's just also because there's a threshold to what I can do. There's just a point where when I know I'm working on a number of stories, I don't need to, look as closely at other things. But for example, at Bloomberg, we used to have 4 computer screens. And on the middle one, it was scrolling down all the time. And but like Cormac and Mike said, it was all about having the alerts and having your own thresholds of what would you even look at. Phase 2 maybe. Anything in animals, please keep it away from me. That's how we deal.
Yeah, but when you mention animal studies, some companies say, okay, we had interesting animal data, and it seems that no one is interested in it, but there was recently a publication on cancer being cured in mice in Nature, and it got huge coverage.
Well, I think the problem is always as soon as something is in Nature, everybody knows they have to have something. And you're not really, at least I feel as a journalist, you don't have the same kind of liberty to decide to not cover something. That's it. You can't say, well, maybe this, I don't think it merits a story, but it merits a story because it was in Science or it was in Nature, and everybody else is going to have it.
Mm-hmm. Sasha?
Yeah, the reason for that is, of course, that you get embargo emails from Nature and Science. There's a whole website, Euric Alert, where you get these press releases with an embargo on it, and you are able to look into these press releases and into the papers a few days before, and then you can prepare your article, and that's great on one hand. On the other hand, you already know that your colleagues do the same, and you have to report about Science on Friday or Nature on Thursday. So this comes with a price, so to say. But I would like to say, so I was on vacation last week, and I got about, I think, something between 4,000 and 5,000 emails, okay? So it's just impossible to read all this stuff. So it's, and I just, deleted them. So because I just have no chance. So on the other hand, and I cheated, of course, because I had them on my phone too. So I looked at least the most important ones within my vacation. So, but the only chance that you have is to have your own filters. Everyone told you that already. So everyone has a certain way to look at all this information. But as a journalist, I think I have to step back from that at least sometimes, from all these forces who want to tell me what I have to report about, and do my own investigations and do my own and set my own topics really. And that's what I would like to have from freelance journalists, for example, coming to my, calling me and telling me, okay, this might be a really good story. I don't have it from the Euric Alert website. It's just my idea. I found that out when I talked with a scientist from company XYZ or so. So actually that's what I did as a freelancer. I did one story and then I had the time to talk with them about even other things that are still in the beginnings, that might be a story in 2 years or so. And just taking this time is hard in these times because you, as the only lonely one at the editorial board, you just don't have the time to go out. But I think this is what is journalism about. We are the ones who need to set the topics and to start debates about new things, new interesting things that come out. And then it's really not important whether it's an animal study or not, because if it's really interesting new science with a totally new way to treat something or so, it's really, for me at least at the science desk, not really important whether it's still in animals or already in phase 2. Okay.
On that subject as well, I think it's very important to recognize that there are entirely different routines, practices, and cultures around reporting academic science and reporting what happens in industry. They're almost like two parallel universes, and obviously there's crossover between them and overlap between them. But so when you have an industry kind of focus, as I do, as Eva does, that's it, yeah, we don't care about animal data, we want to see human patient data, and we don't care about pharmacokinetic data either. But if there is real innovation happening, I mean, if something is reported in Nature, yeah, it might be because this is a new drug mechanism or there's a new insight into an existing drug mechanism that actually is substantive and important. Yes, that's fine. Everybody's okay with that. And I mean, with BioWorld at least, what was kind of nicely done is that the main focus is industry and everybody does the industry, but we have one science editor who, her job is every day to look at what's coming out in Nature, Science, Cell, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she does the science reporting and talks to the academics. And obviously it's important, but it's sort of, it's like its own little universe. And industry PR and academic PR, they're very, very different things. And I think that, and very often, of course, if industry doesn't publish its animal data because they obviously want to keep things under wraps, so they have their own strategy around it, or they might publish it later. And academics will publish it because they want to license it. Well, they'll have obviously patented and all the rest of it first too. But there are different cultures, and sometimes it might be frustrating for industry. I sense that I can hear even a bit of frustration from you, Ludger, that I think some of your frustration on behalf of some of your clients maybe. And I do think it's that, because I think if we look at it from the way an investor would, I know that, say, investors these days move on good animal data in a novel mechanism, and that will turn the dial on an investment these days. It used to before. And we'll move on an investment story. So that's the way of getting it reported, you know. So if somebody raises 20 million on the back of animal data, yeah, sure, we'll talk to them, no problem. But we're not necessarily interested in the animal data per se. But if it's animal data with 20 million attached, yeah, that makes it interesting. Because you know what, the VC has done the filtering for us and tells us that this is good animal data, but not common or garden animal data.
I'd like to reassure the audience that actually not all of us hate animal data. What's actually interesting, and you know, Ludger will have experienced this, and you know, communications people experience this. Journalists have their own biases. So, for example, there'll be some stories that Ludger wouldn't bother to try and pitch to me, but he will pitch it to one of my colleagues because, you know, he knows that they have shown an interest in this particular area before, or they have a particular expertise. It might be sort of in immuno-oncology or in CNS, or it might be, you know, cool science. And, you know, I often get sort of, you know, direct pitches. So rather than sort of the email, I'll actually get the sort of the phone call from someone like Ludger, who will sort of say, hey Mike, this piece of news is, we're going to be sending it out today. I think you should take a look at it because I think this is something that will be of interest to me personally. So that's one of the things you can do, because you're right, in animal data sometimes if it's in a sort of CNS indication, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or whatever, where there's still such a massive unmet need, then that's of significance. We still try and be ahead of the curve. So frankly, once the investment dial is moving, I'm kind of less interested. All it does is just kind of backs up or validates what we are already thinking, if it goes the right way. So we're still actually interested in being ahead of the curve. So that's why we will take that call about the sort of the animal data.
We have now talked about your daily workload, and so I give you an opportunity here to tell the audience what would your life make easier.
I've got one very simple, this is just a tip, and obviously this is widely practiced, but it really makes life easier, and it also gives you a better chance of getting your story published. Giving information under embargo just is great. I know people say it's a kind of a form of collusion or something like that, but if somebody kind of tells you that, and it's very often there's little kind of cultural practices, or not even culture practices is too grand a term, but there's little routines I have with certain sources these days. There's a certain venture capital fund, I've just gotten to know them, and they always contact me for certain stories, and I usually do the interview a couple of days before the thing hits the wires and the story goes out. And what it means is that, in a sense, if you've given me a story under embargo, you've kind of booked me. You've booked me for the day that I'll spend time writing the story, and then it'll go out whenever the embargo lifts and everybody's happy. And it's just a very efficient, effective way of, and I'll give you an example. Say a company had lined me up, or their PR people had, or whatever, about something like a 20 million venture capital deal, and I was writing the story. And I think the very day I was writing the story, a 40 million deal appeared, and normally you'd go for the 40 first, but I was already on the 20. I'd committed to it, I'd done the interview, and I was writing up the story, so I wasn't going to do the 40 million one, and I think a colleague picked it up or something. I'm just saying it's a very, very effective way of getting the story out and ensuring that you will get coverage, and I find it really useful and makes life much easier. For example, there's a story I wrote on Friday that the news came out this morning, and it's already done and dusted, the story, and I haven't even seen whether we've put it up yet or not because of the embargo lifts in American publishing time. I won't even go into that complication, but at the same time it's just done and dusted, and it's a story that actually is being announced here, and so I was able to file it with a Berlin Dateline, even though I wrote it on a train in Ireland.
Stephen, what's the biggest challenge in your work, and what would make your life easier?
Well, I think that this is probably something that won't be specific to me. I think everyone would agree with this. Is that when you put out news, you need to make sure that your phone is on, so that when we call you to ask you questions about it, then you can actually be there to answer them. Because I would say that's probably one of the biggest, sort of most annoying things that happens is when you get a press release, and then you sort of do your triage work as we've discussed, and you decide, okay, we're going to cover this, and so then you call to follow up on, because a lot of times press releases, especially for the information we're looking for, even if it says no more information available, I'm still going to call and ask the questions, because a lot of times that's our job, is we need to ask the questions even if we know what the answers we're going to get. And so yeah, it's probably one of the biggest, most annoying things is when you call and then it goes straight to voicemail or something like that, or you just can't get through to someone. So that's, I guess, one of the things that would make our lives easiest, is to make sure that when you put out news that you are keen on being covered, is to make sure you have someone who can answer the questions by the phone. That's maybe the second one, is when you call and then the other person has no idea, and then they have to go back, and then you don't get your answers for 6 hours or something like that. That's maybe a close second. But,
Sasha?
what would make life easier? Probably if the companies just book ads at the newspapers, so the editorial boards could get bigger. So yeah, that's probably the most important thing, really. Yeah, well, yes, I would like to say that it's hard to report about complicated stuff, which is life science usually, so within a day or so. So I sometimes I'm really annoyed that I know the people and they didn't call me before or a week before and just telling me there might be coming up something. I can't tell you all about it, but it's about X, Y, Z, and then just be prepared. So there might be a possibility. So if I just have one day, I just can't do as good reporting because you have 1,000 other things to do during the day, and then you just miss probably your special topic just because you are not at the editorial board at that day or so. So giving me some days in advance, giving me the time to talk with you over the phone, even on a Sunday or whenever you have the time. So then you would get much better coverage. It might not be perfectly what you want me to report about, but it might be much better from the even from the space at the newspaper. So because we have just one page every day, which is huge actually for at least in comparison to other newspapers, but we can only feature 2-3 topics or so a day. So we need to get things in advance a little bit.
I always think it's good to think about having relationships with a journalist. And so sometimes I might go and talk to a company and even talk to them twice and not write a story, or 3 times. And sometimes I just have a file on my computer and I put everything in there, which is what we call string. And as soon as you have enough string, you can start knitting something, but that can take a year. Sometimes it takes 2 years. And sometimes there won't be a story at all. And I think that's something that's difficult to understand from your side. But for us, sometimes it's just fishing and waiting for that story to come up. And sometimes it does come up, and then you can write a big story. And sometimes we ask you to invest your time, and there's not going to be a story. And that's just the reality of our day.
Yeah. May I add one little thing? So especially if there is kind of a media hype and I need to report about a certain thing, it's really annoying that then it takes so much time to reach the right persons within your companies, especially big pharma, which is really it's undoable. At least in the time that I have 1 or 2 hours or so to get any quotes back or so. And this is sometimes they take a lot of time before or so, but then in these moments I just don't have the time. I need an answer right now, and it doesn't help to get these short sentences via email where I probably think 50 people read it and edited it, and it's just not printable, okay? So just don't send it then, okay, if you have that.
Yeah, and I think it just might also be worth just thinking about what is your story actually about. And I think a lot of companies think their story is, oh, it's our drug and it's in phase 2 and that's the story. But it might be something else, and you might be part of a bigger story. And I think if you know what your narrative is, it will make it easier to sell the information to us. Or if you're an expert in one topic and another company has news, why not talk to us? And then at the same time, you will appear as an expert on this. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to be part of the story without it being an article that is just about your company.
Okay, so looking at my watch again, time for questions. No questions? Okay, then I'd like to ask the question: what do you think? How will journalism look like in 10 years from now, and what will be important? What's the trend? What do you think?
Well, I guess the only thing I would start with is just with sort of the way that sort of news sort of automate sort of the automation that we see now in terms of sort of coverage of. I mean, I think we already see it sometimes with like Reuters and others sort of doing these sort of automated sort of coverage of where they can just take an earnings filing and pull out the relevant numbers, and then that sort of spits it out. And so I think we'll see much more when it comes to just straight news, reporting so-and-so started a phase 1 or so-and-so, got orphan drug designation, these sorts of things, that's all going to be automated. We're not going to need sort of the human input there. And so I think what that'll mean for us, people like me, will be that it's the analysis, sort of the context and everything around that, sort of as Mike was talking about sort of at the start of our panel, sort of the intelligence aspect that's is really where you sort of make the difference, where you differentiate. It's not going to be any longer sort of disseminating the news, it's the analysis. And so I'm hoping that AI has an advance to the point to where they can also do that in 10 years' time, because then I will be, probably I'll work as a landscaper or something. But if that hasn't happened, then that's where I think the real difference will be.
I'd like to pass the microphone around, but if you have any questions, just raise your hand and then we will take them. So, Sasha, your take.
Yeah, I think I'm still very optimistic about at least science journalism. So, because I think people, even in 10 or 20 years, people would like to know how things work, how new therapies are working, or whether they won't work, and so there will always be room to report about it. The only question is whether there will be enough media outlets to cover that, really. So and I think there will be. We won't see so many of them anymore. There will be less opportunities to do that, but as a good science journalist, I think you always have an opportunity to report about science. And examples like STAT, for example, they came more or less out of nothing, and they do much better science reporting now than the Boston Globe was able to do before. And okay, there are 50 people working, I guess, so that's just not possible in Germany, such a big editorial board. But why not, really? So it's still there are opportunities, and I'm optimistic that we will see science reporting in the future too.
Well, I think I totally agree with the automation and the robot journalist. That is something that we already saw at Bloomberg a lot. I'm not sure I totally agree with Sasha with the opportunities drying up. I hope and I believe that we'll see a lot more of these niche publications, or just publications that focus on one topic, be it biopharma, be it sports, be it something else. So that you have one site that, or an email newsletter even, that focuses on a very specific readership, and this readership is going to be a lot more engaged with the content, I think. And I think that's something that we'll see.
Sorry. My response to it is, it's impossible to know exactly what the future holds. I agree with what I've heard. I do think what's happening is that obviously the economic fundamentals of journalism are shifting and have been shifting in the last 10 years or so, and that shift is continuing. And I'm not fully aware of all of it. I just churn out the articles and get paid, and I don't worry too much because I don't run a publication. But I do know, though, that journalism costs money, and good journalism costs money. And I sometimes wonder whether the younger generation, especially that are coming through, kind of appreciate that they expect it to be free, just as they expect music to be free. And it seems, so far at least, that the enterprise of journalism can get sufficient support to maintain itself. And there is definitely a readership for good journalism, and there's definitely a lot of talent capable of producing good journalism. But it's a question of how can those who are doing it meet those who want to consume it in a way that is economically beneficial for both parties. And I'm no expert on that, but I do think that's kind of one of the kind of question marks. And I sometimes wonder, am I just some sort of a kind of a dinosaur, and that the kind of people who pay for my work, you know, when they retire, it'll all just be over, and a bunch of millennials will just kind of say, loser, get out of here, you know, get off the stage. I don't know.
I'd like to have Mike provide the answer, and then there is a question.
Yeah, so millennials wouldn't stick around long enough, though. They get bored before they told you to leave the stage. To Eva's point, actually, about sort of niche products, we're already there. So it's actually already happening, because we've sort of positioned our publications to serve specific audiences. So it's the same news event, but actually we can take that, and depending on whether it's a policy and regulatory audience, or whether it's a commercial business development audience, we will actually write the story in different ways. So it sort of suits the needs and helps them in their daily working. I do believe that there will be this automation, the AI. What it will probably do, it will actually make the people who are at the moment producing the free stuff, it will actually sort of either impact them, or they're going to have to take that on board, because it's not value added. And at least if you've got AI, it'd probably be less expensive than actually hiring journalists to retype out press releases or copy and paste. I think that the future will be, in fact, what we'll see data journalists, where what will happen is we will actually go in and look at the core data and actually generate genuinely innovative views on stories. This is something that I'm pushing my guys to already do, where we get the data and you look at it different ways. You look at it through different lenses, and therefore you end up with a different angle on a different story. I think we'll see more of that, and so that it's not too pessimistic. I actually think also that what we will see is we'll see a divergence between high quality analysis, insight, and then the free stuff, which is tantamount to fake news, in some ways, because most of that free stuff is only telling you what the companies want to tell you in the first place, rather than actually sort of putting it into a real context. So I actually believe that there will be an appetite. We're already seeing it, that there is an appetite for people to actually invest in content. And you're right. I mean, journalists are not inexpensive.
One last question.
Speaking of journalism and millennials and content, do you think there is a rise in video journalism currently, or in 10 years? You think the content that you write about is going to be converted to video, something on YouTube that you can see?
Right. Okay. So we are already doing some of that. So we've got about 150 videos that we've filmed in the last 2 years, alongside with the guys here at EBD, where we come to this conference and other conferences that they run, where we interview thought leaders, whether in biotechs, venture capitalists, big pharma, or what have you. And it's just a different way of delivering content. Will it be the dominant version? I'm not really sure. I think that, what for millennials would like, they'd want a sort of a 6-second video, and I don't think we're going to be able to do that. So, but I do think that we have to be conscious that people consume and want to consume content in different ways. So we're having to be very, very flexible on that.
And I'd just like to come in, I'm totally a print guy, never do video at all, even though I actually did a bit of training in video actually a long time ago. But I find video a very inefficient way of absorbing information. It takes a very long time. I mean, you can scan a paragraph or a story very, very quickly, whereas video, some guy's going to plod on and he's going to tell you how everything is wonderful. I think people like it from the kind of a marketing perspective, and it's kind of, sexy and lights, there's a sort of a sense of glamour about it almost. But it's actually not a very efficient medium. It's definitely, because the technology enables us to use video, I think people fall into the trap of feeling that we must have video. And obviously big corporations especially, they're going to have everything going on at the same time. But I think it has its uses, but it's kind of, be wary of it. It's not very efficient. It's kind of I would regard it as a kind of a slow medium, if I can use that term.
Thank you. So it's almost time to conclude the panel. And as a last question, I would ask the panelists, I know that almost every journalist has in mind to either to publish a book or has already published a book. So I would pass the microphone around to the panelists and ask, have they written a book, and or would they like to write a book? And what was the topic? I have to out myself. I wrote nonfiction and fiction, science thrillers, of course. So, Stephen, what's your favorite idea on a book?
Boy, I don't have any immediate aspirations to author anything at the moment. I feel like I have a hard enough time just keeping up with my current job. To add something on top of that seems infeasible at the moment, but who knows, maybe as I get older and a little better to manage my time, maybe it's something I'll consider, but I can't say I have anything at the moment.
Yeah, time management, I think, is the issue here. I wrote a book with two friends. We did more or less a 2-year investigation, so to say, into biohacking, do-it-yourself, genetic engineering at home, in your basement, wherever. There are some people who are doing this, especially in the US, not so much in Germany yet. And yeah, we wrote a book about that and made a documentary, a 60-minute documentary, TV. That was a huge project. I was still a freelancer at that time, had a little bit more opportunities to actually do that. Was not really a financial success, I would say, which is, I think, always the case with books, and this is also my hesitation for the next one. I have some ideas, but they will probably never be alive, really.
Maybe we should write a thriller about a robot journalist, but I've been developing an idea about a narrative nonfiction book about the early days of the pharmaceutical industry. And as a freelancer, I have a bit more freedom to work on these kind of projects.
There is definitely no book happening right now. I did have a chapter in a book published this summer, summarising the work of a colleague of mine, a very talented journalist in Ireland called Mary Mulvihill, who sadly died prematurely and had left a very, very rich legacy. So I wrote a chapter about her in this book because she had a very, very distinctive kind of way of reporting on science, very, very different from this industry stuff that we go on about. She had a very kind of creative take on it all. I would definitely love to write a full-length book. It's a real aspiration. Right now, I don't feel at the time at all. It's more sort of long-term retirement project type idea, and it could be anything. I've often felt actually something like, I think there's a book in the history of interferon. There's a drug that has sold by the truckload, and nobody really knows properly what it's doing. And yet there's really interesting research coming out trying to understand how people, the sort of the differential responses and whether or not there's some sort of a underlying genetic kind of explanation for that. And I feel in general, this whole notion of blockbuster drugs that have strange ways of producing really good responses in some patients and none at all in others, that topic in general I find really interesting, and maybe something around that. I'm sure it would be a big seller, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I wrote a play when I was young, which was put on by the BBC, and the royalties meant that it was okay while I was a student. And I wrote a book, I suppose you could call it a book, for on the Japanese chemical industry in the early 90s for the Economist Intelligence Unit, which, fortunately, if you do it for something that's actually about business, actually it's more likely to sell, especially if it's got the Economist Intelligence Unit written all over it. There are people who almost feel obliged to buy it.
So with that, I would like to conclude the panel. Thank you very much for your attention, your questions, and I hope we provided some novel insights to you, and we will see you at the conference. So thank you very much.